Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you really want to get a handle on how the world works, if you want to go deeper than the headlines, you really should check out https://learnxyz.in. It's amazing. Seriously, a goldmine of info. Okay, so today we're going deep, like really deep, into diplomacy. That whole world of negotiation and global relations that honestly most people don't think about too much, but it's kind of running the show behind the scenes. And you, our listeners, you're smart. You want to learn stuff fast, but you also want to get the whole picture. And that's what we do best here. So we're going to unpack what diplomacy really is, look back at its long, fascinating history, the different forms it takes, you'd be surprised, and why it matters so much, especially now. We've got a ton of great material for this deep dive, including a super informative article from LearnXYZ called Diplomacy, the Art of Negotiation and Global Relations.
Right.
Our mission today, and I'm serious about this, is to give you those core nuggets of knowledge about diplomacy, its relevance in today's world, without overwhelming you. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is diplomacy? I mean, we hear the word all the time, but what's the real deal?
Well, at its core, you can think of diplomacy as the established way that countries, sovereign states, and now increasingly other players on the global stage interact with each other. It's the main tool they have for managing their relationships. Ideally, diplomacy helps them coexist peacefully and work towards shared goals.
So it's not just about fancy dinners and shaking hands.
Definitely not. It's much more than that. It's a strategic process that involves really subtle communication, reading between the lines, skillful negotiation, and a deep, deep understanding of everyone involved. And what's really interesting is that while the methods and the context have evolved a lot over time, the fundamental need for this kind of interaction has always been there throughout human history.
It's fascinating to think about how this need to communicate and find common ground has been around for so long. So take us back to the beginning. Where did it all start? How did early forms of diplomacy play out?
Well, even in the earliest societies, there was always a need to communicate and negotiate with neighboring groups, whether it was for trade, alliances, or just to settle disputes. Those ancient cities-states and kingdoms, they would send messengers. Think of them as the original diplomats, to carry messages, hammer out agreements, and build some kind of relationship.
It makes sense. Even back then, talking things out had to be better than constant fighting.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Avoiding conflict and securing good deals through communication, that was way better than being at war all the time. And, one of the best examples of this from way, way back is the Treaty of Kadesh in 1259 BC.
Wow, that is going way back.
Yeah, after years of fighting, the Egyptian and Hittite empires, they managed to make this agreement, and it shows a really sophisticated grasp of power dynamics and the benefits of lasting peace. It wasn't just a truce, either. It included things like mutual security guarantees, even a form of extradition. Super advanced for its time.
It's incredible that they had such a formal peace treaty so long ago. But how did we get from those early messengers to something resembling modern diplomacy? What were the key turning points?
Well, the Renaissance in Europe, that was a crucial period. You had powerful city-states popping up, later developing into nation-states, and that led to more formalized and constant diplomatic interactions. This era is when we start seeing permanent embassies, a big shift from just sending envoys when something came up.
Right, having people on the ground all the time must have made a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Having permanent representatives allowed for ongoing communication. Diplomats could actually develop expertise on foreign affairs, and countries could cultivate long-term relationships. The Venetian Republic, for example, they were pioneers in having resident ambassadors. But, the real game changer for modern diplomacy, the moment that really shaped our current state-centric system, that was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Westphalia, that's a name you hear a lot in history and political science classes.
And for good reason. The treaties that came out of it, which ended the 30 Years' War, established a very important principle: state sovereignty. The idea is that each state has total control over its territory and internal affairs without interference from outside.
It's kind of like setting ground rules for how countries interact.
Precisely. It became the foundational principle for international relations, and that, of course, shaped diplomatic practices from that point forward.
So Westphalia creates this framework of independent states. But as the world became more interconnected, Surely that framework needed to evolve, right?
You're absolutely right. The 19th and especially the 20th centuries saw a big rise in multilateralism, the idea that countries need to work together to tackle shared problems. The two world wars really drove that point home, showing everyone just how devastating failed diplomacy can be. They highlighted the urgent need for cooperation on a global scale.
I can see how those conflicts would be a wake-up call.
Absolutely. After World War I, we saw the League of Nations being formed, although it wasn't that successful in preventing another war. But its successor, the UN, established after World War II, that was a much more ambitious attempt at creating a global system for diplomacy.
The UN, definitely a major player on the world stage.
Absolutely. It gave countries a permanent forum to talk, negotiate, and work together on a wide range of issues: peace and security, economic development, human rights, you name it. This was a major evolution from mostly one-on-one interactions between countries to a much more complex web of multilateral engagements.
Okay, so we've gone from messengers to embassies to global organizations. Now, the article we're looking at for this deep dive talks about different types of diplomacy. It's not just one thing, is it? Let's break some of those down. What's the main idea behind bilateral diplomacy?
Bilateral diplomacy, at its heart, it's all about direct interaction between two countries. It's the classic, the foundation of diplomatic engagement. It focuses on building and managing the relationship between those two specific countries.
So just two countries hashing things out directly.
Exactly. And this can cover all sorts of areas: high-level political discussions about security, trade agreements, cultural exchange programs. Think about it. A treaty being signed between two nations, a trade deal after months of negotiations, or even those diplomatic visits where leaders or foreign ministers get together. These are all examples of bilateral diplomacy in action. It's all about trying to find common ground and advance the interests of both sides.
Got it. So two countries, one-on-one. What happens when you have more than two countries at the table? That's where multilateral diplomacy comes in, right?
But you got it. Multilateral diplomacy, it's all about cooperation and negotiation among three or more states. Often this happens within those international organizations we talked about, like the UN, the EU, or the World Trade Organization.
Or in those big global groups.
Yeah. The key here is tackling those global challenges that go beyond any one country's borders, the stuff that needs collective action. Climate change is a perfect example. You need practically every country on Earth to work together, agree on emissions targets, and come up with solutions. And the same goes for things like pandemics, international security threats, and setting international laws.
So the big problems need a big diplomatic effort. It makes sense. Now, I was reading about something called public diplomacy. It seems like it's aimed at a different audience.
That's a sharp observation. You're right. Public diplomacy, it's less about government-to-government talks and more about connecting directly with people in other countries. It's about shaping perceptions, building understanding, and creating goodwill towards a country and its policies.
Kind of like winning hearts and minds on the international stage.
You could say that. It involves all sorts of activities: cultural exchanges like sending students abroad or having art exhibitions, working with international media to get a country's viewpoint out there, even using social media to talk directly to people in other countries. The goal is often to build soft power, the ability to influence others not through force or military might, but through attraction and persuasion.
Interesting, soft power. So it's not just about hard negotiations, it's about building relationships and trust. Makes sense. Now, we live in a globalized world, right? Economics is huge in international relations. How does that tie into diplomacy?
Economic diplomacy. It's a critical part of how countries operate today. It's basically using a nation's economic tools and resources to achieve its foreign policy goals.
So trade and stuff like that.
Right. It can involve negotiating trade agreements, which opens up markets and boosts economic growth, establishing investment partnerships, and sometimes even using financial aid or sanctions to influence other countries. Those complex negotiations around international trade deals, that's economic diplomacy in action. Diplomats are working to balance their own country's economic needs with broader geopolitical concerns.
So trade isn't just about buying and selling. It's part of a bigger diplomatic game.
Exactly.
Okay. And we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the smartphone in everyone's pocket. It seems like everything has a digital side these days. What about diplomacy? How has the digital age changed things?
You're hitting on a really important point. Digital diplomacy, sometimes called e-diplomacy, is here to stay. It's all about using the internet and digital tools to do the work of diplomacy. That could mean using social media to communicate directly with people worldwide, engaging in online discussions with foreign publics and experts, even using digital tools for crisis management and gathering information.
So tweets from embassies, live stream speeches, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It gives countries amazing speed and reach for communication, but there are new challenges too: cybersecurity threats, misinformation spreading online, and the need to adapt those traditional diplomatic protocols to the digital world. It's a whole new landscape.
Fast-paced and with its own risks. I could see that. Now, there was one more type of diplomacy mentioned in the article, preventative diplomacy. What's that all about?
Preventive diplomacy, that's all about taking action before disputes escalate into violence. Trying to stop things from blowing up. It involves getting involved early, mediation, fact-finding missions, sending special envoys to potential hotspots.
So getting ahead of the curve, trying to resolve issues before they turn into major conflicts.
Exactly. The UN is really active in this area. They might deploy peacekeepers as a deterrent or help facilitate dialogue between groups that are at odds. It makes sense. Investing in early intervention is much better than dealing with the aftermath of a full-blown war.
Prevention is always better than cure, right? That makes perfect sense. Now that we have a good handle on what diplomacy is and all the forms it takes, let's talk about why it's so important. What are the real benefits of effective diplomacy in today's world?
Effective diplomacy. It brings huge benefits on multiple levels. First and foremost, it's our main way to resolve conflicts and prevent war.
The big one.
Yeah. Through peaceful negotiation and dialogue, countries can find common ground, deal with grievances, and avoid those terrible costs of war.
That's a pretty compelling reason right there.
It is. Second, diplomacy is crucial for international trade and economic growth. Those agreements that diplomats work on, they make it easier for goods, services, and investments to flow between countries, and that means increased prosperity and more jobs.
The economic side of things.
Right. Then you've got the cultural exchange piece. Diplomacy helps foster understanding between people from different cultures, promoting interactions in education, the arts, science. It helps break down stereotypes, encourages empathy, and creates a more interconnected, more tolerant world. And finally, diplomacy is absolutely essential for tackling those global challenges that no one country can handle alone. Things like climate change, terrorism, global pandemics, and all the ethical issues that come with rapid technological change.
It's a pretty long list.
It is. And these challenges, they demand coordinated action from everyone, and that can only happen through effective diplomacy.
So diplomacy is about peace, it's about economics, it's about understanding between cultures, and it's about tackling those huge global issues. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
That's a great way to put it.
But we know that diplomacy isn't always a success story. It's not always easy, is it? What are some of the biggest challenges that diplomacy faces today? What's making this job so difficult?
You're right. It's definitely not always easy. One of the biggest challenges right now is the rise of geopolitical tensions. We see this in complex relationships, like the one between the United States and China, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine involving Russia, and the constant instability and conflicts in the Middle East.
Those are some serious situations.
They are, and they're often marked by a lack of trust, conflicting interests, and a reluctance to compromise, which makes finding diplomatic solutions incredibly difficult.
I can see that. It sounds like a tough environment for diplomats to navigate.
It is. And then there's the issue of cybersecurity. Cyber attacks can disrupt essential infrastructure, steal sensitive information, and just erode trust between countries, making diplomacy even harder. And we can't forget about misinformation and disinformation online. That stuff can really damage informed public debate and be used to manipulate international relations. It's a real threat.
The digital world, as we said, presents its own challenges.
It does. And on top of that, we're seeing a resurgence of nationalism and protectionism in some parts of the world, which makes countries less willing to cooperate on the global stage. This can really hold back progress on those shared challenges we talked about.
Right. If everyone's just looking out for themselves, it's hard to find common ground.
Exactly. And then you've got these massive, complex issues like climate change. Reaching a global consensus on how to deal with it is a huge diplomatic undertaking, and it often gets bogged down by different economic priorities and political beliefs.
This is not an easy task, that's for sure. But even with all these challenges, have there been any positive developments in diplomacy lately? The article you mentioned pointed to some interesting events between 2022 and 2025.
There have been some encouraging signs, even amidst all the difficulties. One thing that stands out is Saudi Arabia's increasing role in mediating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The fact that they've hosted peace talks in Riyadh and Jeddah suggests that Saudi Arabia, especially under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is looking to play a much bigger role in global diplomacy.
That's interesting. A sign of shifting power dynamics, perhaps?
Perhaps. And then there's the news that Armenia and Azerbaijan, back in 2025, apparently agreed on the language for a historic peace deal. Both the EU and the US welcome that development, so that offers some hope for resolving a long-standing conflict in that region.
Hope is always good. Any other bright spots?
France, under President Macron, has also been quite active in trying to boost its diplomatic influence. They've been working to strengthen ties with the U.S., taking a leading role in European defense, and actively supporting a peace plan for Ukraine in collaboration with the U.K.
So some proactive efforts to de-escalate and build cooperation. What else struck you as significant?
The ongoing expansion of the Artemis Accords, that's another positive sign. The fact that more and more countries, including major players like France, India, Germany, and Brazil, have signed on to these agreements shows that there's a growing global consensus on how we should explore the moon peacefully and cooperatively. That kind of collaboration in a new frontier like space, well, it suggests that maybe, just maybe, we can find ways to work together on other issues too.
Fingers crossed.
Indeed. And, within the U.S., the State Department has been making efforts to modernize. They're incorporating new technologies, promoting diversity in their ranks, and really trying to adapt to this increasingly complex global environment. It shows they recognize that diplomacy needs to evolve to meet the challenges of today.
Adaptation is key, right?
Absolutely.
Now, the article had a really interesting section called the Top 10 Killer Features of Diplomacy. I thought that was a really clever way to sum up the core strengths of diplomacy. Can you give us a quick rundown of those killer features?
Sure. Those 10 features, they really highlight what effective diplomacy can do. They are its role in conflict resolution, that's the foundation. The art of strategic negotiation, where countries try to achieve their goals through dialogue. Crisis management, where you're trying to de-escalate dangerous situations. The promotion of international trade, which is essential for economic prosperity. Fostering cultural exchange and soft power to build positive relationships, shaping global policymaking in international forums, the importance of building alliances for security and common goals, the increasingly important field of cyber and digital diplomacy, the proactive approach of preventive diplomacy, getting ahead of problems, and of course, multilateral cooperation, working together to address global challenges.
Wow, that really covers a lot of ground.
It does. It shows you how essential diplomacy is in international affairs, how many different roles it plays.
It really underscores how multifaceted and important diplomacy is. So, looking ahead, what do you think are the big trends and developments that will shape the future of diplomacy? What's on the horizon?
Well, I think we can expect to see a lot more integration of artificial intelligence and big data analytics to help diplomats analyze complex situations and make more informed decisions during negotiations. AI is going to play a bigger role in how diplomacy works.
AI, that makes sense.
And I think the role of non-state actors, those
Yeah.
multinational companies, NGOs, and even influential individuals, they're going to become even more important in shaping international discussions and outcomes. Diplomats will need to engage with a much broader range of players. It's not just about governments anymore.
So diplomacy is becoming more diffuse, more networked.
That's a good way to put it. And green diplomacy, focusing on those climate change policies and environmental sustainability, that's going to be a huge area of focus going forward. No doubt about it. And as we start venturing further into space, well, we're probably going to see the rise of space diplomacy, where countries have to figure out how to manage space resources and govern activities beyond Earth.
Space diplomacy. That sounds futuristic.
It does, doesn't it? But it's coming.
So diplomacy is going to keep evolving, keep adapting to new technologies and global realities. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember about diplomacy? If they only remember a few things, what should those be?
I think the most important things to remember are that diplomacy isn't just about fancy events and ceremonies. It's a constant, ongoing process that underpins how countries interact. It has a long and fascinating history, evolving over centuries, from those early messengers to the complex multilateral systems we have today.
From ancient messengers to the UN Security Council.
Right. We talked about all the different forms of diplomacy, how each one has its own purpose in managing relationships between states and other actors. And we highlighted why diplomacy is so crucial. Preventing conflict, boosting the global economy, promoting cultural understanding, and tackling those big shared challenges.
So diplomacy is about building a better, more peaceful, more prosperous world.
Exactly. And while diplomacy definitely faces obstacles, there are some positive signs of progress and innovation.
Reasons to be hopeful.
I'd say so. And looking ahead, we know that diplomacy is going to keep adapting to new technologies and changing global realities. It has to.
That's a great overview. Thanks for walking us through all of that.
My pleasure.
And for our listeners, here's a final thought to chew on. In a world that's more connected than ever, where technology is constantly changing how we communicate and interact, how can individuals, even those who aren't diplomats, play a role in fostering understanding and preventing conflict on a global scale? It's something to think about.
It is.
And don't forget to check out https://learnxyz-in. They have a ton of great resources on diplomacy and all sorts of other fascinating topics. You won't be disappointed. If you found this deep dive helpful, please like the podcast or video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future discussions. And a huge thank you for joining us on the deep dive today. Don't forget to visit the site as well and like the podcast video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.